Mr. Harwood emerged from his slumber slowly, as if reluctant to return to this world, yearning to stay in the realm of sleep. Outside the window it was overcast, and rain drummed against the glass, bringing sadness and longing. At such moments one feels apathy, especially when unwell and uncertain about surviving until tomorrow. His body refused to cooperate. When he tried to raise his arm, it held no strength, and within minutes it would dangle lifelessly off the bed. Everything had been so different before. Mr. Harwood had always taken care of himself, going for morning jogs year-round, regardless of weather. Hot or cold, what did it matter? After exercising, his body had been filled with vigor, unlike now, when he lay helpless as a vegetable, muscles weak, dependent on a nurse just to sit up. She would help, naturally, but Mr. Harwood had always relied on himself. He couldn't depend on a nurse's care forever. His condition was deteriorating, and he was desperately thirsty for water, nothing else. Mr. Harwood turned his head toward the closed door. The nurse wasn't likely to come soon. Understandably, she was always busy. He often heard the head nurse's voice behind the door. "Hey, when will you disinfect Ward 7? All talk and no action. And help the patient from 5th Ward. He needs to go for an ultrasound." Mr. Harwood knew they meant him, the patient in Ward 5, a 53-year-old businessman surrounded by mysterious sensors and wires. He'd seen similar equipment in movies' intensive care units, but since he was conscious and alert, this must be an ordinary ward. The room's stark whiteness made it difficult to open his eyes fully, but Mr. Harwood hardly cared. What difference would it make? None. A crushing weakness overwhelmed him anew, and Mr. Harwood sensed the end approaching. "I wonder whom she reprimanded so harshly," he mused. "The modest blonde, or the red-head with the difficult temperament?" He didn't know most of the medical staff's names. He just knew one, Gillian, the kindest amongst them. She maintained impeccable politeness and never showed rudeness. However, the patients of the VIP ward were supposed to be well taken care of, so it was expectable. But not everyone behaved like that. Mr. Harwood had a good doctor. Dr. Doggett had been honest with him from day one. "The situation is serious, but don't lose heart. We'll run more tests for a clearer picture. Meanwhile, stay positive, and try not to worry needlessly." Her candour had lifted his spirits. Perhaps the operation could help, he thought, though Annabeth doesn't believe in it, always insisting it's futile. Easy for her to say from outside. True, Annabeth visits, but not as often as she should. Maybe it's the weather. Autumn was in full swing, leaves falling and dancing in intricate patterns. Mr. Harwood reminisced about his morning jogs in the city park. The yellow leaves on the paths had looked so pristine that stepping on them made him uncomfortable. He wanted to preserve that magical golden pathway untouched. But it was just a dream. Soon enough a janitor would sweep it all away with a few strokes of his broom. In his hospital bed, Mr. Harwood pondered seemingly disconnected thoughts. How long since his son's death? Who would inherit his estate? Who would take over his business? Each question demanded, if not an answer, at least careful consideration. And time he wasn't sure he had. While the businessman contemplated his uncertain future, life continued in the hospital corridor nearby. Head nurse Dana demanded perfect order in everything, though, according to rumours, at the beginning of her career, she was not distinguished by special zeal. The main merit of Dana was her ability to make connections. She would wink at one rich patient, and then she would make up a required document or certificate for another. Well, of course everything was within reasonable limits in accordance with the law. Dana didn't want troubles. Close to the department head, she ruled over the nurses like a queen. she was particularly harsh with Gillian, a sweet, compliant girl who never resisted requests. No one knew why, likely just an instant dislike, common in female workplaces where everything from a hairstyle to a new dress could trigger antipathy. However, Gillian always behaved modestly, tried not to stand out from the crowd, wore simple clothes, and didn't use makeup. Her hair, the colour of ripe wheat, always smelled of herbs and something else. Gillian's partner, Sonia, pondered what this scent reminded her of until she realised it was like strawberries and wild flowers. Not roses, but the kind that grow near rivers, sustained by moisture throughout the summer. She must be using some clever balm or lotion. Look how fragrant it is. And here I buy all the expensive branded products with little effect. Sonia thought enviously, eyeing the young nurse's graceful figure. Truth be told, Sonia had no reason to complain. She was slender and beautiful, though her beauty seemed artificial, like a fashion doll's. Moreover, Sonia was cunning and often tried to push the hardest work onto her colleagues. Now, seizing a moment, she said, "Gillian, take the laundry to the neighbouring building." They mixed everything up again. Sonia's reasoning was simple. She disliked the weather outside, where drizzling rain fell and gusty winds threatened to knock people off their feet. Only janitor Mr. Gish bravely battled the fallen leaves, walking through puddles in his funny rubber overshoes. "All right, I'll handle it soon, but first I need to check on Mr. Harwood in the 5th Ward. That businessman might need help," Gillian agreed. Sonia smiled contentedly. Go ahead then. I can't stand that money bag anyway. The way he looks at me makes my skin crawl." "He's ill and barely leaves his room. What else can you expect?" Gillian objected. Sonia shook her head, indicating she had no desire to discuss such an unpleasant subject. Gillian carefully opened the door and hesitated at the threshold. "Mr. Harwood, may I come in?" The patient noticeably brightened and answered softly, Of course, come in, Gillian. I'd like some water, but I lack the strength to get up. I've been waiting for a nurse, but no one came." Gillian felt embarrassed, having seen Dana in the corridor just 5 minutes ago. "They're busy with rounds coming up, so it's a bit hectic," Gillian replied diplomatically as she poured water from the cooler. "Thank you, Gillian," Mr. Harwood said, his hand trembling as he reached for the glass. The orderly hesitated briefly before helping the exhausted man take a sip. Mr. Harwood felt ashamed of his helplessness, but there was nothing to be done. No one was immune to such circumstances. Yesterday healthy and fine, today unable to get out of bed or quench one's thirst. He looked at the nurse gratefully, tears glistening in his eyes. Gillian understood without words. Some things needed no explanation. She was about to leave when the patient lightly touched her hand. "Gillian, do you have a minute? I need your help." "Of course, I'd be happy to help. Can I get you anything? Should I call a doctor?" Mr. Harwood shook his head. "No, something else. I want to ask you to help me make a will." Gillian turned pale. "A will? What for? I don't know anything about that. Shouldn't you have a lawyer? I'm just an ordinary nurse." The businessman paused, gathering his strength. "No, Gillian, I just need you to write down a simple plan from my words. I have a notebook in my nightstand. You can write everything there. Who gets what? I don't know what tomorrow brings. I've delayed this long enough. I'm afraid of causing trouble." Gillian sighed with relief. "Well, if that's all, I don't mind. It's a bit awkward, but if it's necessary, why not?" Mr. Harwood watched her gratefully. A good girl, always busy like a bee, never resting. Meanwhile, Gillian retrieved a large notebook with tear-off sheets and a fountain pen from the nightstand. A photograph slipped out, a young man standing beside an expensive car. Gillian discreetly glanced at its back, noting the inscription, "From a loving son to a loving father." Embarrassed, she carefully tucked the photo into her notebook. Mr. Harwood closed his eyes, thinking, where to begin? This would be an unusual will. A month ago, he had opened several bank accounts containing substantial sums. They were intended for various people, some unconnected to each other, a friend working as a restaurant administrator, a long-retired schoolteacher, the cemetery caretaker who tended his accident victim son's grave. The late wife's monument needed attention too. The list was extensive, with amounts varying based on the significance of each deed or other factors. Mr. Harwood did not want to handle such accounting through a notary. Above all, he didn't want his young wife to learn the names of the people he mentioned. Annabeth would already inherit his most valuable possessions in the event of his passing: the business, a 2-story house outside the city, and an elite apartment in the centre with its magnificent city view. There was also his minor stepson, Bruce, but Mr. Harwood had provided for him by opening a savings deposit in his name. By the businessman's calculations, when Bruce came of age, he would be quite wealthy and able to manage the money as he wished. Of course, Mr. Harwood could have asked the notary to do what he was asking Gillian to do, but who could guarantee secrecy? And knowing Annabeth's character, she would certainly make life difficult for those people whom her husband wished to thank in this unusual way. Mr. Harwood had just opened his mouth to tell the nurse the first name when the door of the ward burst open. The businessman looked up to see his wife, accompanied by a bespectacled man around 40, carrying a leather briefcase. Even a child could tell that she had brought a professional with her, likely their family lawyer. "Oh, hi, honey, how are you doing? How are you feeling?" Annabeth asked in an artificially concerned voice. Mr. Harwood was about to answer when his wife cut him off again. "And this is Mr. Blake, darling, notary. You mentioned wanting one, so I took the initiative." Mr. Harwood wrinkled his nose and cast an apologetic look at Gillian. The nurse nodded understandingly and returned the notebook to the nightstand. Annabeth smirked. "That's right, dear. Come back later." Gillian only smiled in response and quietly left the room. What else could she do? Annabeth was his legal wife and could do as she pleased. On the other hand, Gillian was grateful for her for interrupting because she was freed from the uncomfortable task of recording the heirs' names. It wasn't the difficulty that bothered her. She simply couldn't imagine this kind, sweet patient passing away. "Everything will be fine. Mr. Harwood's treatment is going well. Dr. Doggett is a heaven-sent doctor." Gillian reassured herself as she hurried to her next task, delivering laundry to the neighbouring building. Such mix-ups happened occasionally during busy times in their department. The air was crisp outside, typical for mid-October, with a cool wind and overcast skies hinting at the approaching winter. Though the heavy snows were still far off, townspeople had already started bundling up more at night. Mr. Gish, the janitor, seemed unbothered by the weather, standing with his broom like a sentry at his post. Seeing Gillian, he smiled. "Here comes Gillian. Let me help you, dear. That bundle's bigger than you are." "No need, Mr. Gish. I can manage. It's not far," Gillian replied. The janitor shrugged and resumed sweeping, gathering leaves into a pile to bag later for the garbage. Passing Mr. Gish's service space, Gillian heard odd sounds through the half-open door, what seemed like voices, then muffled music. Reading the question in her eyes, the janitor explained sheepishly, "It's a TV, Gillian. I got it from the guard for a few days, in exchange for my chess set." Gillian stared at the elderly man in surprise and set her laundry bundle on the bench. "I can't believe what I'm hearing, Mr. Gish. Didn't you say there was nothing worth watching on TV? Just tearful serials and music shows?" "Yes, I did, but I didn't get this thing for myself," the janitor admitted guiltily. "Then for whom?" The question caught Mr. Gish off guard. His expression showed he hesitated to explain. "I got it for the boy. Well, he's a stray who came to me. Oh, what an awful word. Like he's some stray dog." "Oh, Mr. Gish, he's not a stray. More like a homeless," Gillian corrected with a gentle smile. "That's it exactly, my dear. A homeless waif." I was racking my brain, trying to find the right words, but couldn't manage it. You know how my memory fails me. Got knocked on the head once, and I haven't been the same since. Gillian nodded as she remembered the story. Mr. Gish had come to their clinic 6 months ago with a closed head injury. He had worked as a watchman in a warehouse when, during a robbery, he was struck from behind. He ended up in intensive care with no family to visit him and spent a month in a coma. Keeping someone on life support is both troublesome and costly. The employer had immediately fired Mr. Gish retroactively, claiming they didn't know why he was in the warehouse. When they discovered his suspended criminal record, they dismissed the case entirely, suggesting perhaps he was scouting the place to rob it, or his accomplices had turned on him. Who needs an extra mouth? Mr. Gish's situation was critical. For several days he balanced between life and death. His heart even stopped once, but they managed to resuscitate him. Fortunately, after 6 months, Mr. Gish emerged from the coma, underwent rehabilitation and gradually recovered. When he learned the clinic needed a janitor, Mr. Gish begged for this position and was hired. "Now I protect different treasures, natural ones, trees and bushes. They repay me with golden leaves. Is that not wealth?" Mr. Gish said with a smile, leaning on his shovel. Gillian knew he had always been lonely, and now he had taken in a street boy. "Tommy's over there watching cartoons. Such a wise boy, only 7, but he reasons like an adult. He helped me clean up the leaves the other day. Can you imagine? Worth his weight in gold, that child," Mr. Gish explained when Gillian came to the door. She quietly turned the handle and stepped over the threshold. Warmth and comfort enveloped her. Mr. Gish was skilled in maintaining his space. A young boy sat by a small TV on an old sofa. When he heard the door creak, he turned and met the guest's eyes. At the sight of her uniform, he tensed like a frightened wild animal. "Don't be afraid, Tommy, it's Gillian. She's kind and won't turn you into anyone." The boy nodded and smiled. "Hi, buddy. How do you like the cartoons?" she asked gently. "They're good, but I prefer watching superheroes," the boy replied softly. Gillian smiled mysteriously. "I know them well. Tell me, would you like to become one of them?" Tommy looked surprised. "Is that possible? Of course I want to." Gillian laughed, then added, "But if you want to become strong, you need to eat well. You're so thin." Tommy lowered his eyes. "I'm not thin. I'm just growing in the sky direction." Gillian smiled. "All right, don't worry. I'll take the laundry and run to the store. Just wait here, okay? Don't leave." "All right, Gillian. I'll wait," the boy answered. Meanwhile, Mr. Harwood, fighting through his pain, was discussing his will with his young wife. "Darling, you understand, don't you? We shouldn't delay this. A will is an official document. It would give me and my son peace of mind," Annabeth declared, unbothered by the notary's presence. Mr. Harwood's face turned pale as snow. "I remember everything, Annabeth. Of course I do. I just wanted to collect my thoughts and make a rough plan." "Oh, is that all? You could have said so earlier. Here, I've been running around worried like a fool," she said, pursing her lips resentfully. Mr. Blake, the notary, present for the conversation, coughed discreetly, suggesting they should proceed with business. "Darling, let's handle the business matters first. The house isn't going anywhere. It'll be Bruce's family home when he grows up. But the car dealership and specialized workshops need your attention now," Annabeth persisted. Yet the businessman hesitated about making his will. Initially, he wanted to cite weakness and poor health, But Annabeth was really insisting, and her arguments were compelling. "Mr. Harwood, this isn't just for me. Do you want competitors taking over the business? They're not wasting any time, you know." The sick man nodded wearily. "Fine, I'll sign it. But that's all for today, agreed? The real estate and car can wait, okay?" Annabeth's eyes brightened. "Of course, honey. Whatever you say. Just sign right here and here. That's all." Mr. Harwood, with a weakening hand, signed the document and leaned back on the pillow with relief. His head was spinning, and his throat felt as dry as if he had walked through a scorching desert for hours. For Annabeth, however, it was a moment of triumph. When she left her husband's room, she gave the head nurse an approving look and slammed the door behind her. Joyfully waving her elegant handbag, she headed for her car in the parking lot. The notary followed obediently like a puppet on strings. Such compliance usually stemmed from either fear or an impressive sum of money. In this case, the latter, because Annabeth had long been preparing to force her husband to make a will. Being older, Mr. Harwood understood his wife's interest. After all, who wouldn't want to inherit a business that brought stable income? And Annabeth had succeeded, aided by favourable circumstances, namely the death of Mr. Harwood's son Mitch several years ago. Annabeth had never known Mitch personally, seeing him only in photographs. According to her husband, his son had lived life to the fullest, actively pursuing sports, skydiving, and following a vegetarian diet. But Mitch's greatest passion was fast driving, not in the city streets, but on open highways, where the wind against the windshield made his heart race with adrenaline. Mr. Harwood had begged his son not to take unnecessary risks, but for Mitch, risk was like salt to food, essential. When Mr. Harwood urged him to think about starting a family, Mitch would dismiss it. "I'll get there, Dad. What's the hurry? I haven't had my fill of life yet. When I settle down, then I'll start a family." Mr. Harwood would just shake his head. What could he say? His son was an adult who would make his own choices. For Mitch's birthday, the businessman gave him a new car, an exclusive model, unlike his son had owned before. Despite appreciating the gift, Mitch still fought with his father that night. Mr. Harwood had raised the boy alone after his mother's death when Mitch was 3. Though he knew he couldn't provide all the warmth and attention his son craved, he had ensured Mitch had the best nannies and tutors for a proper upbringing and education. But somewhere the businessman's careful plan developed a crack. Mitch grew increasingly independent, which ultimately shaped his character. The final argument erupted unexpected. Mitch, quick to anger, accused his father of the indifference that had driven to death his mother. These words left Mr. Harwood breathless. Like any father, he had dreamed his son would become his pride and support, but everything had turned out differently. Tears welled in Mr. Harwood's eyes as his son slammed the door and stormed out. Mitch got behind the wheel of his new car and gunned the engine. An hour later, Mr. Harwood learned from the news that his son had died after driving off a bridge into the river. The body wasn't found initially, and Mr. Harwood clung to hope that his son had survived. But search teams and divers shook their heads grimly, saying survival was impossible. Mr. Harwood held on to his faith and hope until Mitch was found. The river had carried his body downstream, where local fishermen discovered it. Even then, Mr. Harwood insisted it must be a mistake. Surely the investigation was wrong. It couldn't be his son. No, no, no. But when the businessman went to the morgue for identification, reality crashed down. There lay Mitch, looking just as he had in life. Mr. Harwood's tears told the pathologist all he needed to know. 8 years had passed since then, and Mr. Harwood had begun living with Annabeth only 4 years ago. What did he have to lose? Continue living alone into old age? Who would care for him then? Who would offer comfort and kind words? So Annabeth entered Mr. Harwood's life, a seemingly sweet, kind woman raising her son Bruce alone. Initially, she appeared genuine, honest, beautiful, faithful. Mr. Harwood had always known how to court elegantly, surrounding his chosen one with attention and care from the start. Pleasant surprises, expensive gifts, and enormous bouquets of roses created a daily whirlwind of luxury and affection. Such devotion was difficult to resist. Colleagues and business partners unanimously urged Mr. Harwood to draft a prenuptial agreement. The businessman would nod in agreement, only to lose himself in his woman's green eyes. His acquaintances could only shake their heads, seeing the couple's fate sealed by their 17-year age gap. Mr. Harwood understood friction would arise, as their differing viewpoints had already surfaced. Arguments frequently centred on the strained relationship between Mr. Harwood and his stepson Bruce, who inexplicably avoided his stepfather as if fearing harm from him. After the wedding, Annabeth transformed too, growing imperious and arrogant. Initially, Mr. Harwood had found this change intriguing, but when he discovered signs of a serious illness, he realised his mistake. Then again, his life hadn't been particularly joyful before. Endless work and mental strain, all to amass wealth and achieve financial independence. And now what? The time had come, and he didn't know what to do with the money. Sighing sadly, Mr. Harwood struggled to reach the nightstand, to take out a notebook and make the necessary notes himself. What if he didn't have time? The doctor had assured him there was still time, but it was better to be prepared, to stay one step ahead, especially since sleep would be impossible anyway. Annabeth, on the other hand, was ecstatic. It was no small feat. She had succeeded beyond belief. Her stubborn husband had finally made a will, which meant she could share the news with her closest confidant, the man who had been replacing her husband for months. After dropping the lawyer at the notary's office, she pulled out her cell phone and dialed the number she knew by heart. "Hello, honey. You can congratulate me, Tom. Yes, I'm the rightful heiress. True, it's only on paper for now, but it's just a matter of time. My hubby has his operation tomorrow. I've talked to the right person and found out all the ins and outs." "Who?" "The head nurse. She says my husband is doomed. He's a vegetable. Even if he survives, he won't be able to run the business because most likely he'll be incapacitated." Chuck snorted triumphantly and ended the call. It wasn't by chance he met this Annabeth. She's that kind of woman, ready for fire or flood, and most importantly, Chuck himself stays in the shadows while his mistress does all the work. She'll go to any length for her husband's inheritance. Meanwhile, Chuck had a more delicate task, taking over the Harwood family business. Annabeth had no idea her lover was actually an agent for a criminal group that specialised in seizing established businesses from vulnerable owners. Chuck's arsenal of tools was extensive, from anonymous letters and phone blackmail to arson and vehicle vandalism. Of course, any genuine relationship with Annabeth was out of the question. Chuck's plan was simple. She would inherit and give him partial control of the business shares. For an experienced womanizer with his background, it was trivial. If everything went smoothly, he'd receive his percentage from his employers. Then he could forget about Annabeth and her morose son like a bad dream. But Annabeth knew none of this, and continued making her grand plans of getting rich in the immediate future and enjoying her lover's embraces. Meanwhile, Gillian, after delivering laundry, went to the store as promised to buy treats for Tommy. The saleswoman greeted her with surprise. "Gillian, since when do you buy drinks and sweets? Usually only Sonia and a couple of nurses from your department come in. Don't misunderstand. I'm happy to help a good person. I'm just curious." Gillian smiled sheepishly. "They're not for me. They're for a little boy, about 7 years old. Mr. Gish took him in. He's watching cartoons in his room. He must be hungry. You know Mr. Gish doesn't have much money." The saleswoman nodded sympathetically. "I know, dear. Mr. Gish is a clever man. The yard became spotless as soon as he took over." Gillian sighed and studied the pastry in the display case. Soon she left the shop with a bag of fresh pastries, milk chocolate, and a carton of milkshake. Tommy waited impatiently. After handing the child his treats, Gillian winked at the janitor, suggesting they step outside for fresh air and talk. After a moment's hesitation, she asked that had bothered her since meeting the boy. "Listen, Mr. Gish, how did you meet Tommy? Did he have relatives in the hospital?" The janitor shifted uncomfortably, glanced around and spoke quietly. "Well, you see, Gillian, I've been secretly feeding the stray dogs behind the ambulance station garages. It started with Alf, a dog whose owner died in surgery. It was a hopeless case, but worth trying. Poor Alf grieved for 3 days, sitting and staring at the hospital windows. The nurses told me later that his master was moved 3 times between rooms before ending up in intensive care. In an entirely different building, mind you. Somehow that dog found his master's window every time. I don't know how he did it. He'd sit there for hours in the summer heat until he got heat stroke. Yes, dear, dogs get that too. The poor thing overheated, collapsed and started convulsing. I didn't think Alf would make it. I took him home, nursed him with broth, and saved him. While Alf was recovering, they buried his owner, and the dog has been my friend ever since." Gillian looked at Mr. Gish in bewilderment, still not understanding what could be the connection between the stray dog and Tommy. Having read the question in her eyes, he shook his head and continued, "Don't be angry, my dear, that I started with Alf. Well, from afar, I mean. I can't tell a short story, no matter how hard I try. I'll try to keep it brief, Gillian. Alf started coming to me during my shifts. I can't take him to my place. I live in a hostel. Barely have enough space myself. Where else could I put the dog? The neighbours wouldn't understand. They'd get angry, and I don't need scandals, you know. So Alf started coming to me here, but not alone." "What do you mean, Mr. Gish?" Gillian couldn't help asking. Mr. Gish smiled. "Well, just like that, my dear. He began bringing his vagabond friends. First Countess, a lame sheepdog, then Charlie, a great mongrel. He could eat a whole loaf of bread in one sitting. And then there's Bagel and Jack. All in all, a small pack. I can't feed them bones and meat trimmings every day. Such a feast comes once a week, not more often. I dry breadcrumbs for them and boil porridge on my hot stove. You should see how they gobble it up. In no time the bowls are empty and don't need washing. They even shine like new. Recently I went out to feed the dogs some breadcrumbs. I gave one his portion, when suddenly I heard a child's voice, thin and pitiful. 'Give me a breadcrumb, uncle?' I jumped in surprise. There was a little boy standing among the dogs, like Mowgli. God forbid. So I took him by the hand to my service place where it's warm. That's how I met Tommy. And now I don't know what to do." At this point the old man deliberately paused to let Gillian process what he had said. "What a story!" Gillian exclaimed, and then asked, "But what about his parents? Father, mother, or grandmother? Isn't anyone alive?" The elderly janitor glanced anxiously at the building door before saying, "Tommy says he barely remembers his mother, true or not, but she died in childbirth. He lives with his stepfather, an alcoholic who drinks away the boy's allowance, leaving his stepson hungry. That's why Tommy avoids home, to not see his stepfather." Gillian's cheeks flushed with indignation. "How can this be? There are services for this, social workers, child protection. We should report this scoundrel to the authorities and make his life miserable. This is outrageous. A boy begging for food in the street, while some thug lives off his allowance." Mr. Gish nodded in agreement. "You're right, my dear. I'll help you if needed. I won't stand aside, but we'll need time for the proceedings. Where will he live meanwhile? I can't take him in." Gillian pondered briefly, though the decision came instantly. Let him stay with me for now. My house is small, but it's warm and dry. He can stay with you until the end of your shift, all right?" Mr. Gish looked at the nurse gratefully.
"Thank you, Sunshine. I'll be forever grateful."
Gillian smiled and hurried to the clinic, noticing that the head nurse was watching her closely from the window. The moment she opened the door, her boss confronted her. "Where have you been, Gillian? You went for laundry and disappeared. Stop these games. I won't tolerate it. If you don't want to work, just say so, instead of standing there making eyes at our janitor." Gillian's indignation left her breathless. "How can you say that? What eyes?" Dana sneered. "The same ones you made at that businessman? What do they see in you?" "I don't understand what you're implying, Dana," Gillian mumbled, embarrassed. The head nurse regarded her subordinate with obvious disapproval. "Oh, she doesn't understand. That businessman took ill after you left, but he left you a note. He was practically choking as he handed it to me, saying, 'Give this to Gillian, I beg you.' I can barely understand it." "What a disgrace and unprofessional behaviour, Gillian." A question formed in Gillian's eyes. "The note, where is it?" "Did Mr. Harwood leave it for me?" Gillian asked, overcoming her natural shyness. Dana wrinkled her nose. "You're so tiresome, Gillian. Do you think I'd bother keeping those scribbles? I threw it in the trash. Nothing important. If you must, go look for it yourself, and stop frowning. Come to work on time, and you won't have to dig through garbage." "How is Mr. Harwood now? Is he feeling better?" Gillian redirected the conversation. "Better? Gillian, are you even listening? I told you he felt worse, and after Dr. Doggett examined him, she sent him to surgery. Well, she knows best. She's the doctor after all," the head nurse said with arrogance. Realizing that the conversation was over, Gillian went to the ward and began her usual routine work. The thought that Dana had thrown the note into the waste basket wouldn't leave her mind. My God, why did she do that? Couldn't she have handed it directly to me? Though, what's to be surprised about? She doesn't care about me. She even hates me, Gillian thought while mopping the floor. At that moment, she realized that Mr. Harwood had left the note for a reason, and she had to find it at all costs. But which wastebasket had Dana thrown the crumpled sheet into? Deciding to search the garbage can next to the head nurse's room first, Gillian stealthily began her inspection. And while she was doing this, the head nurse was furtively watching her through the crack in the door, smiling smugly. "I really fooled that simpleton. Did I read the note? Of course I did. I studied it immediately, and sent it to Annabeth in a message. You think I get money from her regularly, and keep an eye on her husband's condition for nothing?" Meanwhile, Gillian, unaware of all this, diligently searched all the garbage cans but found nothing. The truth was that Dana had burned the piece of paper containing the safe deposit box code. When Annabeth got the message with cherished numbers, she felt joyful excitement. Now that's something. What an old fool. He's standing at death's door himself, but still playing with codes like a spy. Did you think I didn't know about that nurse? But I do, you old miser. The news of the secret safe deposit box delighted her lover Chuck too. "What a nice bonus on top of my fee. We'll split everything and then I disappear. Thank you for your attention and love, Annabeth. This has been quite an adventure," thought the young scoundrel on his way to the bank. Annabeth wanted to shout her triumph to the world. There must be a fortune inside this bank deposit box, perhaps even jewellery. Ah, how it's wonderful to be the lucky one. When Annabeth arrived at the bank, introducing Chuck as her bodyguard, the bank clerk graciously accepted the woman's request and offered to escort them to the vault personally. "Mr. Skinner, do you have a bag for the money? We can't exactly walk around with millions in plain sight, can we?" Annabeth asked with a soft giggle. The banker raised an eyebrow. "We can arrange that if necessary. We can even provide a car and security guard. It's all included in the service for our deposit box holders." The journey to the safe deposit vault seemed endless to Annabeth. Stairs, turns, doors, and more stairs. Finally they arrived. Mr. Skinner verified the information and, after a brief pause, placed an oblong box made of fireproof steel before them.
"Is that all?"
Chuck blurted out, trying to guess by sight how much money the makeshift box might contain.
"Well, yes. What else have you been waiting for?"
the banker wondered.
"No, that's fine. Just open it quickly,"
Annabeth said impatiently. Mr. Skinner smiled knowingly.
"It opens quite simply by removing the lid, just like a regular jewellery box, only without hinges or clasps. Shall I step out? That's the protocol."
Chuck lunged for the box and, nearly breaking his fingernails, threw off the lid. The lovers peered inside eagerly, barely suppressing their shocked gasps. The box was empty, or nearly empty, save for a heavy paper envelope at the bottom. "He must have put a bank card in there, probably unlimited or something," Annabeth whispered as she tore open the envelope. But there were no bank cards or account details inside. Instead, the envelope contained Mr. Harwood's torn will and a crumpled piece of paper with a boldly drawn middle finger, that universally understood gesture that needed no explanation. A heavy silence fell over the room until the clerk politely asked,
"Will you be requiring that car with security?"
Annabeth shot him a venomous look before breaking into sobs. Once again, her cunning, far-sighted husband had outmanoeuvred her. Having calculated everything in advance, Mr. Harwood played on the greed of the head nurse, who would surely pass the note to his unfaithful wife. The businessman had long suspected Annabeth's infidelity, but lacked concrete evidence. When she began insisting on drawing up a will during his illness, everything became clear. Now, lying on the operating table, he drifted gently into sleep under the carefully measured dose of anesthesia. Meanwhile, Gillian, unaware of all this, had firmly resolved to adopt Tommy at any cost. That evening she visited the boy's stepfather, but he merely laughed, revelling in his power. Tears glistened in Gillian's eyes. What could she do against this burly, tattooed man? Tommy's cries for help went unanswered, as neighbours hid in their homes, fearing retaliation.
"Had enough? Now get out of here," growled the villain.
What the brute hadn't counted on was faithful Alf and his pack following Gillian and their new friend. The Charlie, the Countess, and a half of a dozen angry dogs quickly turned to the tables, chasing the wretch up a tree with skilled paws and other means best left unmentioned. After dealing with the offender, the dogs rushed to shower the boy with affectionate licks. "Stop! Stop! It tickles!" Tommy laughed joyfully. Just then a photograph slipped from his jacket's left pocket. Gillian picked it up and froze. It showed a pleasant-looking young man in his 20s, standing before a luxury car. His face seemed oddly familiar. "That's my daddy. I found that picture in Mum's belongings," Tommy explained, noticing Gillian's surprised look. Gillian gasped as recognition struck. "I've seen this in Mr. Harwood's notebook. Could this be Mitch Harwood, Tommy's real father?" she wondered. The answer wouldn't come that evening, nor even that week. The entire truth took a month to unravel, revealing many surprises along the way. Mitch Harwood had been involved with Julia, an orphan, shortly before his death in a car accident. She discovered her pregnancy only after his death. Without knowing his family, Julia resolved to raise the child alone, but life proved harsher than the naive orphanage graduate had imagined. Fate led her to David, another former orphanage resident who had graduated 3 years earlier. Believing his persuading and lies, she agreed to let him be her son's father. The rest is known. Julia died in childbirth, leaving her son with only a photo of his father. Mr. Hayward lay weeping on the couch as he beheld the miniature version of his son, holding Nurse Gillian's hand. The private detective, clutching his investigation files, stood awkwardly aside. Annabeth and her lover, Chuck's timely exposure, left them destitute. Overnight, they lost their support, jobs, and influential connections. But for the once doomed businessman, everything changed. The successful operation and finding his grandson kindled new hope on his horizon, giving him fresh energy and motivation. "Welcome, my grandson. We'll never be apart again," he whispered through tears to Tommy. Gillian stepped aside shyly, where Private Detective Michael took her hand with meaningful intent. Their close collaboration during the investigation had blossomed into mutual attraction. Mr. Hayward smiled at the pair. "Well, my dears, will you let this old man dance at your wedding, or am I already past my prime?" The young nurse giggled shyly, giving her fiancé his cue. "Of course you'll dance, Mr. Harwood. And what old man are you? You've got your whole life ahead. This is just the beginning," Michael replied eagerly. The businessman smiled fondly at Gillian, whom he'd come to see as a daughter. How could it be otherwise? Through her help, he had found the grandson he'd longed for all these years.